In 1997, Final Fantasy VII was released on the PlayStation and instantly became a smashing hit. It created an entire generation of JRPG fans and led to an explosion in the genre. For the rest of the PlayStation's lifespan, we were getting classic after classic after classic. The PlayStation 2 era was just as good. We got Final Fantasy X early on and then another wave of great RPGs. However, the genre saw a sharp decline in the 7th generation of consoles, the PS3, Wii, and 360. All of a sudden, we really weren't getting all that much. In 2009, for example, the best console RPGs we got were Star Ocean 4, Rune Factory Frontier, and Muramasa the Demon Blade. Not bad games at all, especially the latter two, but certainly not what you want as the best games in a given year. In comparison, this year we got Ni no Kuni 2, Dragon Quest XI, Valkyria Chronicles 4, and Octopath Traveler. Much better than 2009 if you ask me. So people were starting to talk about how JRPGs were dying, and many fans were looking to Final Fantasy XIII to be the great savior of the genre. But that game was a disappointment for a lot of people, and it looked like the final nail in the coffin for JRPGs. The narrative at the time was that Western RPGs from Bethesda and BioWare were on the rise, and JRPGs were becoming a relic of the past. Now I gotta say, I think a lot of this anti-JRPG stuff was manufactured nonsense, given that the genre was alive and well on handhelds. The DS is right up there with the PS1, PS2, and Super Nintendo as one of the systems with the best RPG libraries, and the PSP ain't half bad either. But the drop in quality RPGs on console was real, and for a lot of people, that matters. Some people just don't like handhelds. Either way, JRPGs clearly didn't die. The genre is alive and well today, and the whole JRPGs are dying thing is basically a meme at this point. Today we will be examining this dark age of JRPGs in the early 7th generation, if you can even call it a dark age, analyze the genre in the current generation, and speculate a little bit about the future. Now I have a confession to make. I came into researching for this video with a conclusion already in mind. I had this narrative in my head that from 2007 to 2010, JRPGs were completely dead and almost nothing came out, and then they made a spectacular return in the later PS3 days and the current generation. And while there is some truth to that, I've come to realize that the reality is just a little bit more complex. Let's get the caveats out of the way. I will be broadly categorizing JRPGs that have come out in the West as great, good, mediocre, and bad. I was originally going to do this based on Metacritic scores, but some games have terribly inaccurate ratings. So instead, I decided to average out the critic review and user scores, with an 80 or higher being great, a 70 to 79 being good, 60 to 69 being mediocre, and anything under 60 being bad. Needless to say, this is not scientific, but until we've got a controlled study with a representative sample, this is the best we've got. And for what a JRPG is, I am roughly going by the criteria of my last video, which is shown right here. That video is in the description. I will also outline in the description some of the more controversial inclusions and exclusions and explain why I did what I did. But either way, the general trends don't change all that much. And finally, games that were considered good or great on multiple platforms will be lumped with the PlayStation consoles for simplicity's sake. Let's take a look at the 7th generation, which consists of the Xbox 360, PS3, and Nintendo Wii. The Wii U is sort of a transitional console, but since its relevant RPGs came out after 2015, it'll be the 8th generation for our purposes. So the first of the 7th generation consoles to be released was the Xbox 360 in 2005. Microsoft didn't do too well with Japanese gamers with their original Xbox, and they decided to change things up this time around. So they made an active effort to court Japanese developers, and they didn't do half bad. We saw what I like to call the big three of the 360, Blue Dragon, Lost Odyssey, and Tales of Vesperia. They also had some other exclusives early on with more mixed reviews, and even some Japanese games that aren't RPGs. Early on, you probably could have made an argument that the 360 was better than the PS3 for Japanese games, but unfortunately the 360 sales in Japan still weren't that great, and after a while it seems like Microsoft gave up and focused their resource on Western audiences, which is really what they still do with the Xbox One. By the end of the 7th generation, a lot of JRPGs were PS3 exclusive. But overall, the Xbox 360 got 2 great JRPGs and 1 good one. The rest were mediocre. The console also got a lot of multi-platform games, which will be lumped with the PlayStation 3. Now let's move on to the Nintendo Wii. The console came out in 2006 and sold like hotcakes, eventually becoming one of the best-selling systems of all time. Normally this would be great news for RPGs, as systems that sell really well tend to also have a great library of games, but the Wii is a different beast. A lot of people bought the system for motion control gimmicks and stuff like Wii Fit, and as a result, you have a lot of shovelware on the platform. Unfortunately, the Wii library is mediocre given how well the system sold, but there definitely still is some good stuff and a lot of gems. Xenoblade Chronicles might just be the best RPG of its generation, and there is some other games to pad the library out. The Nintendo Wii has 5 great RPGs and 7 good ones, and I gotta say, this surprised me a little bit. Before doing the research, I used to think that the Wii RPG library consisted of Xenoblade, The Last Story, Fire Emblem, and a few other stuff. But there seems to be a lot of cult hits on the system, and I'll definitely put some of these games on my radar. Apparently people really like this game called Fragile Dreams. Might just have to check this one out. Let's move on to the big one, the PlayStation 3, which saw a disastrous launch in 2006. The system was $600 and people didn't want it. After 2 generations of crushing the competition, Sony found itself in dead last for most of the 7th gen. And that came with a games drought. There was so little to play on the system that people were excited for Heavenly Sword. The PS3 did ultimately rebound and sold a respectable amount, going roughly even with the 360, and as its sales improved, the game started to come as well. Even with its lackluster first couple of years, the PS3 finished the generation with the best JRPG library. We've got 3 solid Tales games, Ni no Kuni, Valkyria Chronicles, Trails, Disgaea, and a whole bunch of niche hits. The PS3 finishes with 8 great JRPGs and 18 good ones. But unfortunately, the PS3 also has a lot of trash. Some of these games like Mugen Souls and Time and Eternity have become the butt end of a lot of jokes. So between the Wii, 360, and PlayStation 3, Gen 7 finishes with 15 great RPGs and 26 good ones. That's not bad, but keep in mind that a good chunk of these games came out at the tail end of the generation. Some of them, like Trails of Cold Steel, actually had their Western releases when the next generation consoles were already out for a few years. But again, I must admit that a total of 41 good or great RPGs is much better than I thought. 41 JRPGs translates into a lot of game time, and I'm not even going to pretend like I've come close to playing all of these games. I think the idea that JRPGs were dying stemmed from the PlayStation 3 library, which was honestly atrocious for a while. In 2007, the PS3 got nothing. In 2008, it got Valkyria Chronicles, Eternal Sonata, and Disgaea 3. And then in 2009, it got nothing again. People were then looking forward to FF13 in March of 2010, and that was a disappointment for a lot of fans. So if you're a PS3 user in 2010, you're looking at almost 4 years of the system being on the market and almost no RPGs to show for it. I think the 360 and Wii RPGs make this era a little bit more respectable. There's some good stuff there for sure. I also don't want to write off all of the games that have been categorized as mediocre and bad. The PS3, 360, and Wii have a total of 25 mediocre and 6 bad games based on our criteria, and like I said earlier, this is subjective. A lot of them actually had pretty good user scores, but their meta scores were so low that they didn't make the cut. And I'm sure that if I had the time to play all of these games, I would like a good chunk of them. However, there's no denying that there was a big drop in quality RPGs. Just a cursory glance of the PS2 library reveals about 50 JRPGs with a 70 metacritic or higher, and that doesn't even include the GameCube and Dreamcast libraries, or the games with lower metascores but more popular fan reception. So why was there a drop in quality console RPGs? I think a lot of it stems from the problems with the PlayStation 3. For 2 generations, PlayStation was the default system for Japanese games, and especially RPGs, but that changed with the PS3. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the PS3 had the infamous Cell processor. Now, I'm no tech expert, but my understanding is that the Cell processor was very powerful for its time, but also difficult to work with. First-party games on the PS3 were gorgeous, but third-party games had quite a few problems. A lot of Western multi-platform games were actually developed on the 360 and then ported on the PS3 as an afterthought. For example, I know that the Call of Duty games were notorious for being worse on the PS3. Mark Cerny, the architect of the PS4's design, said this about the Cell processor. There was huge performance there, but in order to unlock that performance, you really needed to study it and learn unique ways of using the hardware. Given that JRPGs are already lower budget games, that just makes it much more difficult to make quality games with the Cell processor, and I think that accounts for a lot of the drought. Now, I haven't seen any Japanese developers directly commenting on the Cell processor, but I have seen several articles that share my sentiments. And compounding this were the abysmal sales figures of the PS3. With the system's ridiculous price, the Wii's crazy numbers, and the year-long head start that the 360 had, Sony found themselves in dead last for most of the generation. Developers like to make games that sell well, and games tend to sell well on consoles with larger install bases, so the PS3's initial poor sales acted as a negative feedback. Less sales means less games, and less games means less people who want to buy your console. But eventually the PS3 did rebound and sold pretty well later on in the generation. And coincidentally, we got the best RPGs later on in its lifespan. I think the other big contributing factor is that the console market started to decline in Japan. Now, I'm not super familiar with Japanese culture, but my understanding is that they work a lot. People are always on the move and rarely have time to sit down at home and play a video game. So it makes sense to pick up a handheld and play it on the go. That's why the DS and PSP were big successes and the 3DS did pretty well. Even the Vita sold well in Japan relative to the rest of the world, and that's why we have so many amazing RPGs on all of these systems. Unfortunately, it seems like other than the Switch, the handheld market in Japan has now shifted to phones, but for these past 2 generations, they were definitely a big reason why there were less RPGs on console. Alright, now it's time to look at the current generation. The Xbox One is irrelevant. The Wii U is mostly irrelevant, but there are 2 games of note here. The first is Xenoblade Chronicles X, a spiritual successor to the Wii game. While it wasn't quite as well received as the original, X was still liked by both fans and critics alike. It lands firmly into the great category. The other game is Tokyo Mirage Sessions, which was well received by critics but surrounded by a controversy that disappointed a lot of fans. The game was originally presented as Shin Megami Tensei X Fire Emblem, but my understanding is that the endgame was just SMT with some Fire Emblem cameos. Nonetheless, it still makes the cut to be categorized as good. Now for the PS4. Sony clearly learned their lesson with this system because they made an effort to make it much more developer friendly and launched it at a reasonable price. If only they did that with the Vita. But anyways, to put icing on the cake, Microsoft shot themselves in the foot with their initial Xbox One announcement, and Nintendo was still messing around with gimmicks. By the time the PS4 was on the market, it was pretty clear that it was going to be the king of this generation. And I've played some of my favorite RPGs on this system between Tales of Berseria, Persona 5, and Ys 8, and I think we'll get a few more gems before this generation is over. So overall, the PS4 currently has 8 great RPGs and 21 good ones, and that's already better than the PS3. Alright, and now for our latest console, the Nintendo Switch. I must admit, I was pretty skeptical when the Switch first came out. I wasn't sure if it was just another gimmick, and while I got it early on, it was for one reason only: Zelda. But I gotta say, I absolutely love the system, and the JRPG library is looking pretty good so far. On top of all the good ports and remakes, we've got Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Octopath Traveler, both of which are considered great. There's also Pokemon Let's Go Eevee, which is categorized as good due to poor fan reception, although I think that most of this was because of the pre-release reaction to the game, not the actual quality. From what I've been seeing, the people who actually played the game seem to really like it. Finally, Shining Resonance Refrain is categorized as good. There is a PS4 version, but that one didn't make the cut. So overall, the Switch has 2 great RPGs and 2 good ones, but I think it's going to be a powerhouse for years to come. So looking at the current generation, we are at a total of 11 great and 24 good RPGs. We haven't quite hit the numbers of last generation yet, but we are certainly trending ahead. It's been 5 years since the PS4 launch, so a comparative point in the last generation would be the start of 2012, where we had 6 great and 16 good RPGs across all platforms. So we are clearly doing better than last generation, and the magic number is 6. That's how many good or great RPGs we need before we surpass the total of the PS3, 360, and Wii. And just a glance of the upcoming games gets us pretty close. Kingdom Hearts 3, Fire Emblem 3 Houses, the new Pokemon, Shin Megami Tensei 5, and Grand Blue Fantasy will almost certainly make the cut, and there's tons of stuff coming out that could. I think when all is said and done, we'll have at least 50 good and great RPGs on the current generation consoles. And while a PS5 launch could happen in 2019, 2020 seems to be the more likely scenario. So that's almost 2 years of the PS4's prime left, not to mention all the Switch games and the PS4 games that will come out after the PS5 launch. So again, we will almost certainly surpass the previous generation, but it's yet to be determined by how much. The other interesting thing here is that the quality of RPGs seems to have increased a little bit. Last generation, there were 25 mediocre and 6 bad games, which accounts for 43% of the 7th generation RPGs. This generation, we are currently at 15 mediocre and 3 bad, or 34% of the 8th gen RPGs. So by our metric, there's been a significant improvement in the quality of the games coming out. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Like I said in the introduction, I had this idea painted in my head that last generation was completely dead and this generation has been awesome. I thought that we already had the entirety of last gen beat at this point, and that's just not the case when it comes to the raw numbers. If you cut this generation off right now, it's not clear to me whether the 8th gen beats the 7th gen. It's definitely subjective, and I might even agree that our current library is better than last gen, but I must admit that I didn't think it would be all that close. Upon further inspection, last gen wasn't all that bad, and this generation hasn't been absolutely spectacular. The reality is that the PS1 and PS2 golden age is over, and quite frankly, I don't think it will ever come back. I would say that there's been a moderate resurgence, a clear uptick in the numbers in a comparative time frame, but not exactly a return to PS2 levels of greatness. Sales-wise, it seems like the genre is doing pretty well, but it's not all positive. Of course, it's difficult to get sales data for every single game because companies don't always release it, but we know that in recent memory, Persona 5 crushed its predecessors, Nier Automata did incredibly well, Octopath Traveler surpassed Square's expectations, and Final Fantasy 15 posted good numbers. However, it seems to me that Valkyria Chronicles 4 didn't do all that well, and I'm not quite sure that Dragon Quest XI really broke into the Western market like Square wanted. It's tough to gauge, but I think despite a few setbacks, the market for JRPGs seems to be growing a little bit, but that could just be wishful thinking. We'll have to wait and see. So why has there been an increase in console RPGs this generation? I think for one, the PS4 is successful. Again, JRPGs have lived and died with PlayStation for 20 years now, so when the PlayStation does well, JRPGs do well. And on top of that, the PS4 is much more developer friendly than the PS3 was. Sony learned from their mistakes. Next is the rise of indies. That might sound a little bit odd, but hear me out here. Indies obviously existed before this generation, but they have become more prominent in the past few years. And this creates a general attitude that graphics aren't necessarily everything. Since JRPGs are lower budget games with thin profit margins, sometimes developers just don't have the resources to produce the very best graphics and performance. So if you ask me, indies have made it more acceptable to put out lower budget games on console. This is why we've had a lot of games come out on Vita and PS4. Having an Ys game or even a Dragon Quest on console would have been inconceivable last generation, but it's become normal on the PS4. It's also become very clear that people do want single-player games. Last generation there was talk of single-player games completely vanishing, but it's pretty obvious now that multiplayer and single-player games can coexist. And this might be subjective, but I do feel like people have become more receptive to JRPGs in general. I've seen much more positive things about the genre online, and a lot of my friends who previously weren't playing JRPGs picked up Persona or Nier. Again, this is subjective. Okay, so let's put it all together. The 7th generation of consoles saw a clear drop in JRPGs, largely due to the failures of the PS3. However, I don't think it was all that bad. There's at least 40 games worth checking out here, and I'm willing to bet that nobody watching this has played all of them. The talk of JRPGs dying was largely exaggerated, especially given the fact that a lot of the market shifted to handhelds. This generation we've seen a solid rise in quality JRPGs on console, and it's most certainly welcome. And this could be attributed to the PS4's success, an increased willingness to put out lower budget games, and possibly even an improved attitude towards JRPGs. So where does the genre go from here? There's no signs that JRPGs are slowing down, and I'm willing to bet that they will continue to rise in the next few years. It's undoubtedly still a niche genre, but the fans are dedicated and we are obviously buying enough to justify the continued release of RPGs. In my opinion, as long as consoles are around, JRPGs will be around. And since there will almost certainly be a PS5, JRPGs are going to be alive and well for the foreseeable future. And even if consoles kick the bucket, PC games will still be around, at least in the West. I haven't even mentioned this, but there's been an unprecedented rise in JRPGs on PC in the past few years, and we've gotten a lot of good stuff out of it. The only concern for me would be that it's not clear to me how popular PC gaming is in Japan, but I highly doubt that Japan would just abandon JRPGs altogether. My worst case scenario is one in which we only get gacha phone games for eternity, but I think that's very unlikely. The bottom line is this: JRPGs are here to stay for a very long time, and that's great news. In general, I'm very excited for what the future has in store. I think it's going to be great. And that about wraps things up for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.